What if I told you that Princess Diana recorded her deepest, darkest secrets on a cassette tape that has been hidden for over 30 years? What if I told you that on this tape, Diana confesses to multiple suicide attempts, including one horrific incident when she was pregnant with Prince William? This isn't another rumor or tabloid story. This is Diana speaking in her own voice, revealing the devastating truth about her life behind palace walls. For decades, these recordings were too shocking to release. But now, the most haunting confessions from the People's Princess have finally surfaced. What you're about to hear will shatter everything you thought you knew about Diana's fairy tale life. Her words are so raw, so heartbreaking, that they will stay with you forever. This is the story the royal family never wanted you to hear. If you want to honor Diana's 1991, Kensington Palace, Diana's private sitting room. It was a gray London afternoon in 1991 when Princess Diana sat alone in her private sitting room at Kensington Palace, a small cassette recorder placed carefully on the coffee table before her. At 30 years old, she had been trapped in a loveless marriage for a decade, but the world still saw her as the fairy tale princess who had everything. Diana's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the record button. She knew what she was about to do could destroy the monarchy, could shatter the carefully constructed image of royal perfection that had been built around her. But she couldn't stay silent anymore. The pain was consuming her from the inside out. Dr. James Colthurst, her trusted friend since their meeting in France when she was just 17, had set up this clandestine recording session. The plan was simple, yet dangerous. Diana would pour out her heart onto tape. Colthurst would smuggle the cassettes out of the palace in his bicycle basket, and journalist Andrew Morton would craft her story into a book that would shock the world. "I don't know if I can do this," Diana whispered to Colthurst as he clipped the tiny microphone to her blouse. The sitting room that would later become her son's playroom felt like a confessional booth, heavy with secrets that had been eating away at her for years. "The world needs to hear your truth," Colthurst replied gently. "You've been suffering in silence for too long." Diana took a deep breath and pressed the record button. What came out was not the polished, rehearsed voice of a royal princess, but the broken, desperate words of a woman who was drowning in her own life. "I suppose I should start at the beginning," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm not sure I know where that is anymore. Everything feels like it's been one long nightmare since the day I said, 'I do.'" As Diana spoke, the floodgates opened. Words poured out of her like water through a broken dam. Words she had held back for years. Truths so dark and devastating that even she seemed shocked to hear them spoken aloud. She talked about her wedding day, which she called the worst day of my life, about Charles's obsession with Camilla, about the complete isolation she felt within the royal family. But it was when Diana began to talk about her mental state that the recordings became truly harrowing. Her voice took on a different quality, raw, broken, desperate. She spoke about nights when she couldn't sleep, about the torment and anguish in her head, about feeling so alone that she couldn't see any way out. "I knew what was wrong with me, but nobody else around me understood me," she confessed, her voice cracking with emotion. "I needed rest, and to be looked after inside my house, and for people to understand the torment and anguish going on in my head." The most shocking revelations were yet to come. As Diana continued speaking, she began to describe incidents that would make even the most seasoned mental health professionals recoil in horror. These weren't cries for attention or dramatic gestures. These were genuine attempts to end the unbearable pain she was living with every single day. Colthurst sat in stunned silence as Diana revealed the depths of her despair. What she said next would change everything anyone thought they knew about the woman the world called the People's Princess. Her confessions were so dark, so heartbreaking, that they would haunt everyone who heard them for the rest of their lives. January 1982. Sandringham House. The Queen's private residence, Diana's voice on the tape became almost childlike as she transported herself back to one of the darkest moments of her life. It was January 1982, just 6 months after her fairy tale wedding, and she was 4 months pregnant with Prince William. But instead of glowing with maternal joy, Diana was spiraling into a depression so deep she could barely function. "When I was 4 months pregnant with William," Diana began, her voice trembling with the memory, "I threw myself downstairs, trying to get my husband's attention, for him to listen to me." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Even through the crackling audio of the decades-old recording, the pain in her voice was unmistakable. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a dramatic gesture. This was a desperate woman's attempt to make someone, anyone, acknowledge her suffering. Diana continued, her voice growing stronger as she relived that horrific day at Sandringham. "I had told Charles I felt so desperate and I was crying my eyes out. He said I was crying wolf. 'I'm not going to listen,' he said. 'You're always doing this to me. I'm going riding now.'" The callousness of Charles's response was breathtaking. Here was his pregnant wife, clearly in distress, begging for help, and his reaction was to dismiss her entirely and go horseback riding. For Diana, already feeling isolated and unloved, it was the final straw. "So I threw myself down the stairs," she confessed, the words coming out in a rush as if she needed to get them out before she lost courage. The Queen comes out, absolutely horrified, shaking. She was so frightened. The image Diana painted was devastating. Her Majesty the Queen, the epitome of royal composure, standing at the foot of the stairs watching her pregnant daughter-in-law lying crumpled and bruised, having just attempted to harm herself and her unborn child. It was a scene that would have been unthinkable to the public, who saw the royal family as the picture of stability and tradition. But even more heartbreaking was what happened next. Diana had risked her life and the life of her unborn child in a desperate attempt to make her husband realize how much she was suffering. Surely, she thought, this would finally make him understand. "I knew I wasn't going to lose the baby," Diana continued, "though I was quite bruised around the stomach." She had calculated the fall, ensuring that while she would be injured, the baby would survive. Even in her darkest moment, her maternal instinct protected her child. When he came back, it was just dismissal, total dismissal. He just carried on out of the door, Diana revealed, her voice barely audible. The devastation in those words was profound. Charles had returned from his ride to find his wife injured and traumatized from a suicide attempt, and his response was complete indifference. The Queen, however, was a different story. According to Diana's account, Her Majesty was absolutely horrified by what she had witnessed. For a woman who had spent her entire life maintaining the dignity and reputation of the monarchy, seeing her daughter-in-law attempt suicide in her own home must have been beyond comprehension. Diana's confession revealed the impossible situation she found herself in. She was trapped in a loveless marriage, ignored by her husband, and suffering from severe depression and bulimia. Yet she was expected to maintain the perfect royal facade, to smile and wave and pretend that everything was wonderful. What Diana said next would reveal that this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of self-harm that would continue for years. Her desperate attempts to get help would only escalate, becoming more. 1982, 1985, various royal residences. The hidden nightmare. As Diana's confessions continued on the tape, a horrifying pattern began to emerge. The incident at Sandringham wasn't an isolated cry for help. It was the beginning of years of self-destructive behavior that would escalate to terrifying heights. "We had a few trying to cut wrists, throwing things out of windows, breaking glass," Diana revealed with a matter-of-fact tone that was perhaps even more chilling than emotional outbursts would have been. "I gave everybody a fright." The casual way she listed these suicide attempts was deeply disturbing. This wasn't someone recounting isolated incidents of despair. This was a woman who had made hurting herself a regular occurrence, a desperate form of communication in a world where no one seemed to listen to her words. Diana went on to describe one particularly harrowing incident that would shock even those who thought they knew the extent of her suffering. The night before, I'd wanted to talk to Charles about something. He wouldn't listen to me, so I picked up his penknife off his dressing table and scratched myself heavily down my chest and both thighs. There was a lot of blood, and he hadn't made any reaction whatsoever. The image Diana painted was horrific. A young woman so desperate for her husband's attention that she would mutilate herself, leaving deep scratches across her chest and thighs until blood flowed freely. And Charles's response? Absolutely nothing. No concern, no comfort, no acknowledgement that his wife was clearly in psychological crisis. The next morning, Diana revealed, her sister Jane noticed the injuries when she wore a V-neck top. She said, "Dooch, what's that marking on your chest?" When I told her, Jane just went for me. She said, "You mustn't let the side down." Even Diana's own family prioritized the royal family's reputation over her mental health and safety. Rather than expressing concern or trying to get her help, her sister's immediate reaction was to worry about potential scandal. Diana was truly alone in her suffering, but perhaps the most disturbing revelation was yet to come. Diana described another suicide attempt that demonstrated just how far her desperation had pushed her. "I was running around with a lemon knife, one with the serrated edges," she confessed, her voice growing quieter as she recalled the memory. The image of the future mother of the heir to the throne running through a royal palace with a serrated knife threatening to harm herself was almost too shocking to comprehend. Yet this was the reality Diana was living. A reality so different from the fairy tale narrative the public believed that it seemed almost impossible. Diana also revealed that she had thrown herself against a glass display cabinet at Kensington Palace, shattering it in another desperate attempt to get anyone to acknowledge her pain. Each incident was a cry for help, a desperate attempt to make the royal family understand that she was drowning in her own life. "I couldn't sleep. I just never slept. I went for 3 nights without any sleep at all. I had no fuel to sleep on," Diana confessed. The insomnia, combined with her eating disorder and depression, was creating a perfect storm of psychological distress that was pushing her closer and closer to the edge. Throughout all of these incidents, Diana was maintaining her public duties, smiling and waving at crowds, opening hospitals, and attending state dinners. The contrast between her public persona and her private hell was so extreme that it seemed almost schizophrenic. What made these revelations even more heartbreaking was the knowledge that Diana was still 91, the hidden addiction that nearly killed her. As Diana continued her devastating confessions, she revealed another secret that would shock the world: her battle with bulimia nervosa, an eating disorder that had consumed her life since the early days of her marriage. My husband put his hand on my waistline and said, "Oh, a bit chubby here, aren't we?" And that triggered off something in me, Diana revealed, her voice filled with pain at the memory. "And the Camilla thing. I was desperate. The trigger for Diana's eating disorder was both heartbreakingly simple and profoundly devastating. A thoughtless comment from her husband about her weight, combined with the knowledge of his ongoing affair with Camilla Parker Bowles, had sent a young woman spiraling into a destructive cycle that would dominate her life for years. "I remember the first time I made myself sick," Diana continued, her confession becoming more raw and honest with each word. "I was so thrilled because I thought this was the release of tension." What Diana described was the classic pattern of bulimia, the initial relief that binging and purging seemed to provide, the sense that she had found a way to cope with emotions too overwhelming to process. But what started as a release quickly became a prison. "The first time I was measured for my wedding dress, I was 29 inches around the waist," Diana revealed. "The day I got married, I was 23.5 inches. I had shrunk into nothing from February to July. I had shrunk to nothing." The numbers were staggering. In just 5 months, from her engagement to her wedding day, Diana had lost over 5 inches from her waist. For a woman who was already naturally slender, this kind of weight loss would have been alarming to anyone paying attention. But apparently, no one in the royal household noticed or cared that the future Princess of Wales was literally wasting away before their eyes. Diana's description of her bulimia was heartbreakingly clinical. You inflict it upon yourself because your self-esteem is at a low ebb and you don't think you're worthy or valuable. You fill your stomach up 4 or 5 times a day. Some do it more, and it gives you a feeling of comfort. It's like having a pair of arms around you, but it's temporary. The way Diana described bulimia revealed her deep understanding of the psychological mechanisms behind her disorder. She knew exactly what she was doing and why she was doing it, but knowing didn't make it any easier to stop. The eating disorder had become her primary coping mechanism for dealing with the impossible pressures of royal life and her loveless marriage. I was crying out for help, but giving the wrong signals, and people were using my bulimia as a coat on a hanger. They decided that was the problem. Diana was unstable, she explained. Even when people became aware of her eating disorder, they used it as evidence of her instability rather than recognizing it as a symptom of deeper problems. What made Diana's bulimia even more tragic was that it developed just 1 week after her engagement to Charles. The fairy tale princess that the world fell in love with was already struggling with a serious mental health condition before she even walked down the aisle. The pressure of becoming royal, combined with Charles's cruelty and the knowledge of his affair, had created the perfect conditions for psychological breakdown. Diana's bulimia would continue for years, a secret addiction that she carried while performing her public duties and raising her children. The woman who seemed to have everything was slowly destroying herself from the inside out, and no one around her seemed to notice or care enough to help. (1982, 1991) Behind Palace Walls. The system that failed her. As Diana's tape continued, she revealed the most heartbreaking aspect of her suffering, the complete failure of the royal family to provide support or understanding when she desperately needed help. A doctor came and saw me. I told him I was being sick, making myself sick. He didn't know what to say because the issue was too big for him to handle. He just gave me a pill and shut me up, Diana confessed, her voice reflecting the abandonment she felt by those who should have protected her. The royal family's response to Diana's crisis was to medicate her into silence rather than address the underlying problems. Instead of getting her proper psychiatric care or removing her from the toxic environment that was destroying her mental health, they simply wanted her to be quiet and maintain appearances. Diana revealed that Queen Elizabeth herself was complicit in this cruel dismissal of her suffering. "I don't know what my husband fed her, the Queen. He definitely told her about my bulimia, and she told everybody that was the reason why our marriage had cracked up, because of Diana's eating, and it must be so difficult for Charles." The Queen had turned Diana's eating disorder into a convenient excuse for the marriage's problems, completely ignoring Charles's affair with Camilla and his emotional abuse of his young wife. According to Diana's account, the Queen portrayed Charles as the long-suffering husband dealing with an unstable wife rather than acknowledging that Diana's illness was a direct result of the trauma she was experiencing within the royal family. On the outside, people were saying I gave my husband a hard time, that I was acting like a spoiled child. But I knew I just needed rest and patience and time to adapt to all the roles that were required of me overnight, Diana explained, her voice filled with frustration at being so misunderstood. Even more devastating was Prince Philip's reported involvement in the family's rejection of Diana. According to her account, Philip had actually given Charles permission to return to his bachelor habits if the marriage wasn't working after 5 years. This wasn't a family trying to save a marriage. This was a family planning its dissolution while completely ignoring the mental health crisis of a young mother. Perhaps the cruelest revelation was how the royal family had turned even Diana's own son against her. She described a heartbreaking incident when 3-year-old William had told her she was the most selfish woman he'd ever met. I was so stunned. I said, "Where did you hear that?" He said, "Oh, I've often heard Papa saying it," Diana revealed, her voice breaking with the memory. Charles had been so consistently cruel to Diana that their toddler son had begun parroting his father's harsh words. "The one thing I've always prided myself on, if I may be so bold, is that I've never been a selfish person. But Charles was always telling me I was being selfish, and I sort of believed it," Diana confessed. The psychological abuse was so systematic that Diana had begun to internalize her husband's cruel assessments of her character. Diana also revealed that she had deliberately isolated herself from her friends because she was too ashamed of her situation. "I shut my friends out because I didn't want to pull them in on it. I would be too embarrassed to ask them to come in for lunch. I couldn't cope with that. I would be apologizing the whole way through lunch." The picture Diana painted was of a young woman completely abandoned by the institution that should have protected her, gaslit by her husband into believing she was the problem, and so ashamed of her situation that she cut herself off from any potential sources of support. She was trapped in a golden 1991-2025, the tapes that changed everything. As Diana's confessions came to an end on those secret tapes, she had no way of knowing that her words would eventually change not just how the world saw her, but how we understand mental health, domestic abuse, and the human cost of institutional power. "It was all a desperate cry for help," Diana concluded, her voice exhausted from reliving years of trauma. "I wasn't spoiled. I just needed to be allowed to adapt to my new position. I needed time to adjust to my new position. One minute I was a nobody. The next minute I was Princess of Wales, mother, media toy, member of this family, and it was just too much for one person to handle." These words, spoken in private in 1991, would not see the light of day until after Diana's death in 1997. When Andrew Morton finally revealed that Diana herself had been the source for his explosive biography, the world was forced to confront the devastating truth. The fairy tale princess had been living in hell. The impact of Diana's confessions was seismic. Her willingness to speak openly about bulimia helped thousands of people understand that eating disorders weren't about vanity or attention-seeking. They were serious mental health conditions that could affect anyone, even a princess. In the years during which Diana spoke publicly about her bulimia, rates of women seeking treatment for bulimia in Great Britain more than doubled. If she could overcome her eating disorder, they could too, became a common sentiment among those who found strength in Diana's honesty. Her admission that bulimia was like having a pair of arms around you, but it's temporary, helped people understand the psychological mechanism behind the disorder in a way that clinical descriptions never could. But perhaps more importantly, Diana's confessions about her suicide attempts opened up conversations about mental health that had been taboo for generations. Her description of the torment and anguish in her head gave voice to millions of people who had suffered in silence, unable to articulate their own psychological pain. Diana's revelation that even someone with every material advantage could be driven to attempt suicide helped destigmatize mental health struggles across all social classes. Her words, "I knew what was wrong with me, but nobody else around me understood me," resonated with anyone who had ever felt isolated in their suffering. The tapes also exposed the dark reality behind the glamorous facade of the British royal family. Diana's accounts of Charles's emotional abuse, the Queen's cold dismissal of her suffering, and the institutional gaslighting she experienced revealed that even the most powerful families could be deeply dysfunctional. Today, more than 3 decades after Diana first spoke those words into her tape recorder, her confessions remain as powerful and relevant as ever. In an age where we're finally beginning to understand trauma, domestic abuse, and mental health in more sophisticated ways, Diana's words seem almost prophetic. Prince William and Prince Harry have both spoken about how their mother's openness about mental health inspired their own advocacy work. William's support for suicide prevention and Harry's discussions of his own mental health struggles are direct legacies of their mother's courage in speaking her truth. I had so many dreams as a young girl that I wanted and hoped that my husband would look after me. He would be a father figure and he'd support me, encourage me, say, "Well done," or, "No, it wasn't good enough," Diana had confessed on those tapes. Her dream was heartbreakingly simple: to be loved and supported by the man she married. Diana never got that love from Charles, but her confession of that need and her willingness to speak honestly about what happens when it's absent has helped countless people understand their own worth. Princess Diana's secret suicide tapes reveal the devastating truth behind the fairy tale facade, that even a princess can suffer from depression, bulimia, and suicidal thoughts when trapped in an emotionally abusive situation. Her courage in recording these confessions, despite knowing the risks, helped change how the world understands mental health. Diana's words, "I was just so desperate. I needed people to understand the torment and anguish going on in my head," give voice to millions who have suffered in silence. Her honesty about bulimia, her suicide attempts, and the royal family's cruel response opened conversations that continue to save lives today. These recordings weren't just confessions. They were Diana's gift to the world, proof that no one should have to suffer alone, no matter how perfect their life appears from the outside. Her willingness to speak her truth, even when it could have destroyed her, showed extraordinary courage that continues to inspire mental health advocacy worldwide. If Diana's story touched your heart and reminded you that everyone deserves to be heard and helped, please subscribe to honor her memory. Share this with someone who needs to know they're not alone in their struggles. Remember Diana not just as a princess, but as a survivor who used her voice to help others find theirs. Her legacy lives on in every person who finds the courage to speak their truth and seek help. Mental health support is available. You are worthy of love and